Søren Kierkegaard became influential because he understood something most philosophers try to escape. Human beings are not disturbed merely because life is difficult. They are disturbed because consciousness itself creates instability. The more aware you become of possibility, choice, time, failure, death, and responsibility, the harder it becomes to exist innocently. Anxiety is not just a medical problem or an emotional inconvenience for Kierkegaard. It is woven into what it means to be human. That idea feels profound because it captures something real. There are forms of anxiety that do not come from immediate danger. They come from awareness itself. A person standing safely at the edge of a cliff suddenly imagines the possibility of jumping. Not because they want to die, but because consciousness recognizes freedom. The realization that you could act differently at any moment creates a strange psychological dizziness. Kierkegaard calls this the dizziness of freedom. This is one of his most famous insights. Anxiety emerges not only from fear of external threats, but from the awareness of possibility itself. Human beings are unsettled because they are not fixed creatures. They constantly confront futures that remain open and uncertain. You're never fully locked into one path. You must choose, and every choice excludes countless others forever. That observation still resonates deeply. Modern people often experience anxiety precisely because life contains too many possibilities rather than too few. Careers, identities, relationships, beliefs, values all remain open questions for far longer than in traditional societies. The self becomes something you must continuously shape rather than simply inherit. Kierkegaard recognized this psychological burden long before modern existentialism turned it into a broader philosophy. At first, this makes his work feel unusually honest. Unlike systems that promise certainty or rational stability, Kierkegaard begins from inward struggle. Doubt, despair, contradiction, anxiety, these are not treated as flaws to eliminate through abstract theory. They are conditions of existence itself. Philosophy becomes intensely personal because the real question is no longer merely what is true, but how an individual lives with truth. This gives his writing emotional power. He understands that human beings do not suffer only from lack of information. They suffer from inward conflict. A person can know what is right and still fail to act. They can understand morality intellectually while remaining spiritually fragmented. Kierkegaard forces philosophy to confront the emotional reality of being human instead of pretending reason alone solves existential tension. But this is also where the danger begins, because Kierkegaard does not simply describe anxiety. He elevates it into something spiritually meaningful. Anxiety becomes a gateway to deeper existence, a sign that the individual is confronting freedom, possibility, and ultimately the relationship between self and God. Suffering gains existential significance rather than remaining merely psychological pain. That transformation changes how anxiety is interpreted. Instead of asking how to reduce unnecessary anxiety, the philosophy often encourages people to dwell inside it as evidence of seriousness. Inner turmoil becomes associated with authenticity. Despair becomes spiritually revealing. Doubt becomes a sign of depth. The more inwardly troubled you are, the more existentially awake you appear. This can become psychologically dangerous very quickly, because not all anxiety is profound. Sometimes anxiety is simply suffering. Sometimes confusion is not existential awakening, but mental exhaustion. Sometimes despair does not reveal hidden truth about existence. It merely damages a person's ability to function coherently. Kierkegaard's philosophy can blur these distinctions by giving emotional struggle an almost sacred significance. That is part of why intelligent people are drawn to him. He makes inward suffering feel meaningful rather than embarrassing. In a world obsessed with productivity and surface-level happiness, Kierkegaard validates the seriousness of existential discomfort. He tells anxious people that their anxiety may reveal something important about the human condition itself. And often he is right. But the danger is proportion. Once anxiety becomes philosophically romanticized, people can start mistaking emotional intensity for depth. Psychological instability begins to feel spiritually superior to ordinary stability. Calm people appear shallow. Uncertainty appears wiser than conviction. The inwardly tormented individual becomes the model of authenticity because suffering is treated as evidence of existential seriousness. This creates a subtle but important distortion. A philosophy that correctly identifies anxiety as part of human existence slowly begins treating anxiety as a privileged state rather than a condition to navigate carefully. The individual becomes trapped inside self-examination, endlessly interpreting emotional tension as existential significance. Kierkegaard intensifies inwardness to an extraordinary degree. The self is constantly relating to itself, questioning itself, confronting itself before God and possibility. That level of introspection can produce genuine self-awareness, but it can also become psychologically consuming. Instead of living directly, a person begins endlessly analyzing the spiritual meaning of their emotional state. And eventually, anxiety stops being something you experience. It becomes part of your identity. That is where Kierkegaard's philosophy starts turning inward so intensely that suffering itself begins to feel profound simply because it is suffering. Kierkegaard's philosophy becomes even more complicated when anxiety stops being a temporary human experience and starts becoming the primary lens through which existence is interpreted. At first, his work feels refreshing because it refuses shallow optimism. He does not pretend human beings are naturally calm, rational, or internally unified. He understands that consciousness creates tension. The self is divided between possibility and limitation, freedom and fear, time and eternity. To exist as a human being is already to live inside contradiction. That insight gives his writing unusual emotional force. Unlike philosophers who treat reason as something capable of resolving existential instability completely, Kierkegaard insists that inward conflict cannot simply be solved like a mathematical problem. Human beings are not detached intellects. They are emotional, fearful, self-questioning creatures trying to orient themselves inside uncertainty. This makes his philosophy feel psychologically honest. But honesty can slowly turn into glorification, because Kierkegaard often writes as though anxiety is not merely unavoidable, but spiritually privileged. The anxious individual appears deeper than the comfortable individual, because anxiety supposedly reveals awareness of freedom, mortality, responsibility, and the uncertainty of existence itself. Suffering becomes evidence that the individual is confronting reality seriously rather than hiding inside superficial certainty. This creates a dangerous cultural tendency. The more inwardly distressed a person feels, the easier it becomes to interpret that distress as proof of depth. Anxiety starts looking intellectually superior to peace. Doubt appears more authentic than confidence. Emotional turmoil becomes associated with philosophical seriousness. And once that happens, psychological suffering gains a strange prestige. You can see versions of this everywhere in modern intellectual culture. People often speak as though emotional heaviness automatically indicates wisdom, while calmness suggests superficiality. The person constantly struggling inwardly appears more profound than the person who feels stable and grounded. Kierkegaard did not invent this tendency entirely, but his philosophy gives it powerful existential legitimacy. The problem is that anxiety itself does not guarantee insight. A person can be deeply anxious and completely confused. They can suffer intensely without becoming wiser. They can interpret ordinary uncertainty as profound existential revelation simply because the philosophy encourages them to treat inward turmoil as meaningful. This is where Kierkegaard's focus on inwardness becomes psychologically risky. The self turns inward again and again, constantly examining its own despair, doubt, fear, and spiritual condition. Instead of engaging directly with life, the individual becomes absorbed in interpreting the existential significance of their emotional state. Reflection deepens endlessly, but endless reflection can become paralysis. There's a point where self-awareness stops clarifying existence and starts trapping a person inside themselves. Every emotion becomes symbolic. Every uncertainty becomes spiritually loaded. Ordinary psychological discomfort gains existential weight far beyond what human beings can carry calmly. Kierkegaard often intensifies this pressure by linking anxiety to faith. For him, genuine faith is not comfortable certainty. It requires confronting uncertainty without rational guarantees. The famous leap of faith emerges precisely because reason cannot fully resolve existential tension. You must commit despite uncertainty. Again, this sounds profound, and in some ways it is. Human life really does require commitments that cannot be mathematically proven in advance. Love, trust, morality, purpose all involve forms of risk that reason alone cannot eliminate. Kierkegaard recognizes something important here about the limits of pure rationality, but he pushes this insight into a kind of existential extremity. Faith becomes heroic precisely because it survives anxiety rather than dissolving it. The individual stands alone before God, isolated from objective certainty, carrying inward tension without resolution. This gives religious existence emotional intensity, but it also turns spiritual life into permanent existential struggle. That struggle can become addictive, not because suffering feels pleasant, but because suffering starts feeling meaningful. A person begins interpreting peace with suspicion. If anxiety reveals spiritual seriousness, then calmness may start looking shallow or dishonest. The individual unconsciously learns to remain psychologically unsettled because inward struggle has become connected to identity itself. This is one of the hidden dangers in romanticizing existential suffering. You stop asking whether anxiety is helping you live better and start treating anxiety itself as evidence that you are living more deeply than others. The suffering becomes self-validating. It no longer points beyond itself toward clarity or growth. It becomes part of the self's understanding of its own importance. And once that happens, the philosophy can trap people inside a permanent atmosphere of seriousness where ordinary happiness begins to feel philosophically naive. That is not wisdom. It is a form of existential imbalance, because a healthy life cannot remain permanently suspended in inward crisis. Human beings need moments where they are not endlessly confronting possibility, despair, and spiritual uncertainty. They need participation in life, not only reflection on life. They need relationships, routines, work, affection, and forms of stability that allow consciousness to rest rather than constantly interrogate itself. Kierkegaard understood the depth of anxiety brilliantly. What he underestimated was how easily people can become attached to anxiety once it starts feeling profound. The final problem with Kierkegaard is that he transforms existential struggle into a kind of spiritual identity. What begins as an honest recognition of human anxiety slowly becomes a philosophy where inward suffering starts carrying moral and intellectual prestige. The individual wrestling with despair appears more authentic than the person living calmly. Emotional instability begins to look spiritually awake, while ordinary contentment risks appearing superficial. That is why Kierkegaard continues attracting deeply reflective people. He validates the experience of inner conflict in a world that often treats suffering as either weakness or dysfunction. He tells anxious people that their anxiety may reveal something important about freedom, responsibility, mortality, and the difficulty of being human. In that sense, his philosophy feels compassionate toward inward struggle rather than dismissive of it. But compassion can quietly become romanticization. And once suffering becomes romanticized, people stop relating to it clearly. This is the hidden danger inside Kierkegaard's vision of existential seriousness. Anxiety is no longer merely something to endure carefully. It becomes evidence that you are confronting life at a deeper level than ordinary people. Doubt becomes spiritually elevated. Despair becomes existentially meaningful. Inner torment begins to feel connected to authenticity itself. That connection is psychologically unstable because emotional intensity is not the same as wisdom. A person can spend years trapped in self-analysis, uncertainty, and existential heaviness without becoming more truthful, compassionate, or mature. They may simply become more absorbed in themselves. Kierkegaard's philosophy often pushes consciousness inward so intensely that reflection starts replacing participation in life. The self becomes obsessed with itself. Am I truly authentic? Am I avoiding faith? Am I confronting existence honestly enough? Am I living deeply or mechanically? The inward gaze never relaxes. Every emotional state becomes existentially loaded with meaning. Instead of reducing suffering, the philosophy risks deepening a person's attachment to it. This is where existential seriousness becomes unhealthy, because human beings are not meant to live permanently inside spiritual crisis. Reflection matters, but so does ordinary life. Friendship, work, affection, laughter, routine, love, these are not distractions from existence. They are part of existence. Kierkegaard often writes as though inward confrontation is the highest form of human life. But endless inwardness can isolate people from the very world they're trying to understand. There's also a deeper contradiction inside his idea of faith. Kierkegaard criticizes purely rational systems because he believes real faith requires uncertainty. You cannot prove meaning objectively and then calmly possess it. You must leap despite doubt. This gives faith emotional intensity and personal seriousness, but also creates a strange relationship with certainty itself. The individual becomes trapped, needing uncertainty in order to preserve the authenticity of faith. Anxiety cannot disappear too much, because anxiety is what makes faith existentially meaningful. Peace starts feeling suspicious. Calm belief appears less profound than tormented belief. Stability risks looking spiritually shallow. That is a dangerous psychological pattern, because a healthy spiritual life should eventually help a person live more fully, not trap them inside permanent existential tension. Kierkegaard understands the importance of confronting despair, but he does not always recognize how easily people can become attached to despair once it starts feeling philosophically significant. And modern culture amplifies this tendency enormously. Today, many people already confuse emotional heaviness with depth. The troubled person is often treated as more intelligent, more authentic, more emotionally awake than the stable person. Kierkegaard's philosophy unintentionally reinforces this instinct by making anxiety central to serious existence. But wisdom is not constant torment. A truly mature person does not need to remain permanently anxious in order to prove they understand life deeply. They can recognize uncertainty without worshiping it. They can acknowledge suffering without building an identity around suffering. They can think seriously without turning existence into endless self-interrogation. That balance matters. Without reflection, people become shallow and mechanical. But without rest from reflection, people become psychologically consumed by themselves. Kierkegaard brilliantly understood that human beings are not simple creatures of reason. He saw how freedom, possibility, and self-awareness generate anxiety at the core of existence. He recognized that suffering can reveal truths comfortable people avoid. Those insights are real and powerful. But he pushed inwardness so far that anxiety itself began acquiring an almost sacred aura. And once suffering feels profound simply because it is suffering, philosophy stops helping people navigate existential pain wisely. It starts teaching them to identify with the pain itself. That is why Kierkegaard can feel extraordinarily deep while also quietly encouraging a relationship to anxiety that becomes psychologically difficult to escape. He understood existential struggle brilliantly, but he made anxiety sound so spiritually meaningful that many people stop trying to move through it and begin treating it as proof that they're finally living seriously enough.